Coming up on Theater Talk.
Let's just say Americans are pretty contentious and argumentative. Theater gets to be, that's the nature of creativity, conflict, and that's the nature of Shakespeare's plays is conflict.
Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation. From New York City, this is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins.
And I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post. And Susan, there is a terrific new book out, Shakespeare in America, an anthology from the Revolution to contemporary times, edited by my old Columbia University professor, James Shapiro, and our Shakespeare expert. Welcome to Theater Talk, as always.
Great to see
Welcome
you.
back to Theater Talk.
Thank
yes.
you, Susan. Great
Yeah,
to see you.
I just love this book, and it's a wonderful idea to capture Shakespeare's impact in America. What got you thinking about this?
Everybody's talking about global Shakespeare.
Right.
There's a production of the Globe Theater right now going to every country, including North Korea.
And we've had a lot of Shakespeare here in New York, the Twelfth Night from the old Mark Rylance's production and all that stuff.
Everybody's coming in. The RC will be back, I'm sure, in the next year or so. And I thought, I've always loved Shakespeare, and I think he's the same everywhere.
Yeah.
And I've been going to England since I was a teenager, roughing it, going to see plays in London and Edinburgh Festival. So I always kind of collapse the difference between British Shakespeare and American Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, though, it's really a different phenomenon, from the American musical to how we look at Shakespeare to Pabst's public theater Shakespeare.
That very, what's the word I want to say, not working class Shakespeare, but the accessible Shakespeare to the common man, to the working class New Yorker.
That's it. So America's a different kind of beast than England or Britain. Mm-hmm. And I thought, why not spend a couple of years thinking about what impact Shakespeare's had on America and what kind of story 200 some odd years of Shakespeare in America tells.
Mm-hmm. So take us in the beginning. When is the sort of the earliest traces of Shakespearean productions here in America? Do we know?
We do. It was a kind of iffy thing, in part because the people who came over to settle this country were Puritans in the North, and
they didn't like the theater.
They hated the theater. No Shakespeare allowed whatsoever.
Right.
We're shutting down the theater, and this stuff is not going to work here. Mm-hmm. And then we broke with England. Mm-hmm. So why would we want to take in their national poet as our own, insofar as we're creating our own national culture and literature?
Yeah.
And so it was nip and tuck. And it wasn't until the end of the 19th century that writers like Willa Cather, who's reading Shakespeare, as a teenager, loves it, reviewing it, ends up saying he has two countries now in which he is the great national poet.
It was wonderful that in the 19th century there were touring companies of Shakespeare through the Old West, and it really was something that people could share that no other writer had before that time.
That's probably why Shakespeare thrived in 19th century America. There wasn't, a body of American plays, let alone musicals, let alone burlesques, that you could take on the road. So early on in the early 19th century, late 18th century, there were production companies touring, and it caught on. And it was across the nation, whether it was mining camps in California or in Nebraska where Willa Cather's writing, or my favorite story in the whole collection is when Ulysses S. Grant got to rehearse the part of Desdemona in Corpus Christi, Texas, before they invaded Mexico. So you can't make a lot of these stories up. No. And it becomes an alternative version of American history, at least an alternative to the version I was force-fed in high school.
There is a, I want to take it back a little further, though, to going to the Founding Fathers, though, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, these were extremely well-educated men. They knew world literature. Did Shakespeare have an impact on them at all?
He did. Jefferson and Adams went to Shakespeare's birthplace, and somebody hustled them and sold them a splinter of the chair that Shakespeare sat in. There were 47 chairs they were carving splinters out of. And Adams' wife said, he cherished this relic. You could have made this a collection about American presidents in Shakespeare. And Bill Clinton very graciously
wrote the
forward to this book, and he loved Shakespeare, and he quoted Shakespeare, in part because these presidents are people who live under pressure, and nobody writes about people under pressure better than Shakespeare.
Nobody writes about politicians better than Shakespeare.
That is true too, and you get these moments in American history. Lincoln sitting in the White House during the Civil War, reading not To Be or Not to Be, but the guilty speeches of Hamlet's uncle in that play, and just think this really must have touched them. Why is he quoting Claudius? You know, just those kind of questions, or Richard III. So you could really immerse yourself forever in the ways in which Shakespeare has shaped American culture and shaped American politics.
Now, in the 19th century, I know in Britain, and I wonder if this happened in America too, remember they would put on the happy endings of Shakespeare?
Yeah.
Was this a phenomenon that took place in this country as well?
You know what? Everybody loves a happy ending. And they brought it all over here as well.
So where, you know, Cordelia doesn't die.
Oh, why not? Look, I've seen a lot of great Shakespeare over the last years in America, and a lot of it ends up being happier than it was written in the time. I think audiences just crave, those tragedies are just too dark. Maybe not too dark for a depressive like Lincoln, but too dark for the rest.
Life is too depressing.
It is.
You know, something I learned about reading your anthology was 165 years ago, the Astor Place Shakespeare Riots. Now, what was that about?
There are very few things that Americans have killed each other over.
Yes.
The Revolution was one of those moments. Civil War was the most terrible of those moments. And people have died fighting over civil rights in the South and a number of other issues. But I don't know another writer who has caused Americans to fire on, kill, and wound fellow Americans. 1849, as you say, there was a British actor named William Mccready who was playing Macbeth not far from where we sit at the Astor Place Theater. And young louts, probably just like I was a young lout growing up in New York, who didn't like this highbrow British invasion and really preferred American Shakespeare. And his rival, the great American actor, probably the first native-born American actor who reached that status, Edwin Forrest, was playing Macbeth across town. And they wanted American Macbeth, not British Macbeth. And, you know, they just picked up cobblestones and started trashing whatever they could. The guard was called out. The crowd was fired on. And I think this is one of the very few times this story has ever been reprinted in full.
Somebody compared it to Altamont with me. That it was like the Hells Angels running in
You know,
to have a fight, but it happened to be about Shakespeare.
Henry James didn't like this. He thought it was, you know, barbarian. But they had a point. There was a kind of fracture at that moment between Shakespeare everywhere and Shakespeare highbrow, lowbrow. And it gives you a sense of how much people just cared about Shakespeare. I mean, who's willing to fight to the death over Shakespeare?
And 20 people were killed, right?
20 killed, about 100 injured, and it left a deep scar, I think, on the theater culture of New York.
Did it give Shakespeare a bad name at all?
No, it did not.
Shakespeare survived the...
Shakespeare just, you know...
He's invincible.
He just has that quality of being able to dodge a punch. And to this day, he only keeps getting bigger and more important to
One of the wonderful photographs in the book, and also an essay, is about Orson Welles and the famous Voodoo Macbeth. You have a fabulous picture, which I hope you can drop in, of the Voodoo Macbeth. Tell us the story, if you will, of that.
Sure. Most people don't realize that Orson Welles was probably the greatest interpreter, and I mean across the board, scholars, actors, throwing everybody into the mix, the greatest interpreter of Shakespeare in the first half of the 20th century, maybe in the 20th century, and especially as a young man. And he had just had the success with his famous fascist Julius Caesar,
right,
where the Sin of the Poets scene really captured fascist hooligans killing somebody they distrusted. Modern dress production. I love giving talks in New York, and there's always somebody in the second row. I always ask, who here saw Orson Welles' Julius Caesar? And when the hands go up, I seek them out afterwards and talk about that production. Fewer people that I've spoken with were there for Voodoo Macbeth, which was up in Harlem. And I was just up in that neighborhood yesterday at a friend's house, and unfortunately they didn't make a national heritage site out of this theater. But
The theater is still there, though.
the building is still there, or they're transforming it into something other than a theater. And it was one of the great adaptations of Shakespeare in this country, a voodoo Macbeth. Early kind of musical quality to it, Wells using an African-American cast, and there are pictures of the throngs in Harlem rushing to see this.
And the story goes, maybe apocryphal, that there was a critic who panned it, and the real witch doctors, voodoo doctors in the show, they did some voodoo ceremony, and the critic supposedly dropped dead of a heart attack.
He did indeed.
It's a true story, then.
And I think that should be a good warning to every critic who's going to criticize a Shakespeare production that's not quite what they expect.
What is your couple of your particular favorite entries in this?
I have a couple. One is, I didn't know about it at all. Jane Addams. Jane Addams, first American woman to win a Nobel Peace Prize. That's what I've always thought of. Hull House in Chicago.
Had to read it in Contemporary Civilization at Columbia.
She has a real patriarchal dad who dies. He wouldn't let her go to college back east. He was controlling. And she came from the aristocracy of Chicago. And one other member of that Chicago aristocracy was a man named Pullman. Pullman made railroad coaches and cars, and he created a little city called Pullman, and he required all his workers to live there, and pay him gas, utilities, and when he laid a bunch of them off, he didn't lower their rent, and they were either going to starve or fight. So there was a riot, a revolt, and Pullman felt the man more sinned against than sinning. And Jane Addams and others went to talk to him, and he just said, you know, they're not showing me the kind of respect that a leader of my greatness deserves. And the president called in the troops because this affected our national railroad and transportation mail systems, and they violently suppressed this riot. And she wrote a brilliant essay called A Modern Lear, in which she talks about industrial America. It's as relevant now, probably more relevant now than it was in 1895. What happens when the 1% are controlling our lives? And she writes about Pullman as King Lear, and as a tragic man who thinks he is maligned and doesn't understand his relationship.
And who's out of touch.
Who is completely out of touch. And it's a story, King Lear gets rewritten as a late 19th century story about industrial action and violence. It's a killer story, and I love it.
We should touch, although briefly though, on Joe Papp, because he very significant in making Shakespeare a part of this city, really, and making it accessible for all.
I have to say that putting together this volume changed my thinking about Shakespeare and what Papp was able to do, insisting that the people on the stage reflect the people in the audience. And I'm now advising productions at the Public Theater, and we took a production into Rikers Island just a few months ago, Much Ado, terrific production. Watching inmates forget that they are incarcerated for 95 minutes while watching Much Ado, and watching them respond in a way that's probably closer to how Shakespeare's audiences responded. You know, when Hero collapses, they all rush up, she's down, she's down. You realize what Papp created, something that just doesn't reach aristocrats or rich people on the east side or west side, but can dig down and touch so many lives in the city.
He took several beatings, though, for some of those Shakespeare productions by the critics over there. I remember John Simon, in particular, was really rough on the non-traditional casting and all that stuff back then.
And Frank Rich.
Yeah, you've got it.
I love Frank Rich as a writer. He tried taking Joe Papp on in the New York Times.
Yep, it's
and
in
the Times gave Papp, you know, last punch. And it was, you know, let's just say Americans are pretty contentious and argumentative. Theater gets to be, that's the nature of creativity, conflict, and that's the nature of Shakespeare's plays is conflict. So there's a lot of conflict in this volume, and you know, I love that about Americans writing about Shakespeare too.
Yeah. Well, it's a great book, Shakespeare in America, an anthology from the Revolution to now, edited by our good friend James Shapiro.
But it's worth the price of the book alone to read the wonderful panel discussion between Jerome Robbins, Stephen Sondheim, and Arthur Lawrence in 1985 when they speak about how they harmoniously put together West Side Story, probably the greatest musical.
I call that piece Rashomon.
Yes.
That all three of them got along, though, was sort of amazing because they didn't get along very often. So it's out from the Modern Library, too, a really handsome...
Not Modern Library, Library of America.
I'm sorry, Library of America. They give you a very handsome book jacket.
They did a beautiful job.
I love, by the way, this picture of Shakespeare. Do you have a particular favorite portrait of Shakespeare? Is this?
This right now is, because it's on the cover of my book.
Spoken like a good publicity machine, which Shakespeare was too, right?
He wouldn't have survived otherwise.
Okay, Jim Shapiro.
It's great seeing you both.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Back.
Here she is, boys. Here she is, world. Here's Rose.
So, Michael, I do not need to tell you or our viewers that Gypsy is probably the greatest musical ever written. The story of Rose Thompson and her two daughters in show business. But did the musical, called A Musical Fable, tell the true story?
No, it did not.
No, it did not. As they
Gypsy
admitted
is a
at the time.
lie.
Well, as they said at the time, it was called A Musical Fable to avoid lawsuits. We now have Mama Rose's turn. The true story of America's most notorious stage mother, written by Carolyn Quinn, our guest right now on Theater Talk. Carolyn?
Was Mama Rose a first-class bitch, as we've all come to believe? Or was she maligned by Arthur Lawrence and Steve Sondheim and Julie
I
Stein?
think it was a little of each, actually.
Yes.
She was, in some ways, much better than I thought she was going to turn out to be when I started researching her, and in some ways, a lot worse.
Give us an example of the worst.
The worst, yes.
Well, Gypsy Rose Lee was supporting this woman in absolute style. She would set her up in beautiful houses. At one point, she was in a house, Witchwood Manor, in Highland Mills, New York, with, I think, 10 rooms and a pool and all this stuff, and a chauffeur, and she had furs, she had jewels, and Rose would take her to court for non-support. So, you know, like to get attention. And she'd show up at court, driven in the chauffeur, driven limousine, in the mink, in the jewels. The press would be astounded, and she'd waltz in there and try to get more money from her daughter, who was already giving her so much.
Wow. Did she really kill somebody, though? Arthur Lawrence always told me that the real Mama Rose shoved a guy out the window. Is that
I
true?
found no evidence of any of that whatsoever. Unfortunately, it would have made a much better and more interesting story, but
Do you think
But
she was
Arthur-
capable of killing somebody?
probably, yes,
You think so?
probably.
But now,
That driven, that.
I don't know if it was driven so much.
Go ahead. Yeah.
More like, I think if she was pushed to the wall, she could have.
Can you give us an example of maybe a kinder side to her, something you found that was nice about her?
Yes, she was pretty much raising all these children that were in the vaudeville act. She had a handicapped boy, like a mentally handicapped boy in the act, and raising him fell onto her. Later, when June left the act and they were like stranded in Kansas, and she had to contact their old chauffeur Henry in Brooklyn, New York, to come out and get them and drive the car back to Seattle, she realized he had like holes in his shoes, and she went right out with this boy and she bought him a new pair of shoes the minute she saw it. She wasn't, in some respects, she really wasn't even a fraction as bad as people would have thought. But then again, in others, suing her children.
What happened to the husband? Her husband?
Her husband, he married another lady and moved to California. They had 2 children.
Mr. Hovick.
Yes.
He just picked
I'm
up
in
and
touch
left?
with his granddaughter, and no, he tried to get custody of the children of June and Louise because he didn't think Rose was a fit mother.
Good
be
God,
schlepping them all over the country.
Showbiz would have been totally different had he got custody.
And she apparently was saying that he tried to strangle her and all kinds of things, and everyone in his family said they never saw any evidence of any of this from him. So it was like a he said, she said, and the judge, I think, just erred on the side of reason and went with her story.
But what is real about the musical that you tell us in the book is how she was in Seattle, right?
She was in
And
Seattle.
she said, I'm going to go into show business with my girls. I'm going to get out of here. And did.
Well, I think what happened initially was she was taking the girls to dancing lessons, and June was sitting on the sidelines, and she got up one day and tried to dance on her toes like the other kids in the dancing class. And she put June into the dancing school, which I've seen out in Seattle, the building. It's in the old Oddfellows Hall building out in Seattle. And the child just became so interested in it, she was like a dancing prodigy. And when you have a child who's a prodigy in those days, and you like theater and you like vaudeville, it was kind of a natural progression.
And also you need money.
Put the child into vaudeville.
Yeah.
Which they had, because they were always renting out property. There were a family of hoteliers from Minnesota initially, before they moved out to the Seattle area. And they had two houses, where one house they were living in some of the rooms, and they were renting out others, and they were renting out the house next door. So they had money all over the place. They weren't like as blue collar and impoverished as people said in GYPSY. You could put them down in the desert and they'd find a way to make money. They were kind of fascinating in that respect.
Now, she was, though, Mama Rose, who was Madame Rose, actually.
It was
Madame Rose.
Madame Rose, yes, but in the public mind,
become
she's
Mama.
always called Mama Rose, so we called it Mama Rose's turn.
But she was a kleptomaniac after she did steal in the way it shows in the musical.
Yes, and I think she trained the children on various ways of getting around the law, too. Like, if they wanted to steal something, they'd wear the outfit with the biggest pockets and stuff like this.
Oh, that's clever. How come Gypsy Rose Lee
Vaudeville.
took such good care of her? I mean, what did she feel about her mother? Was she a monster she loved?
I'm not entirely certain. She took care of the mother, the grandmother, and the aunt. She was taking care of the three main adults in her family for years.
Well,
I think she was like obligated and
That's just what people did
took
back then.
took care of them, but she did it, and I think she was never like given the amount of credit she was due for like just being so generous to her family.
But you describe a situation with the relationship between Gypsy Rose Lee and her mother, that they were,
Yes.
even though they would stop speaking to each other for long periods of time, they were very tightly bonded, and they had spent that time together
Yes.
on the road. There was no father, there was no significant men, and came and went, and then Louise did run off at age 15. That bond was never really broken.
At one point, they were having a fight because Rose liberated furniture from Gypsy's house, and she must have needed a truck.
She must have had a lot of big
There was
pockets of that.
a 10-page long handwritten list of the inventory of furniture that she stole out of the house that I found in the Performing Arts Library. 10 pages long from the caretaker. You sit there and you read this, and you're just like, I don't believe what I'm sitting here reading. And after that, Gypsy wasn't speaking to her for a while. Gypsy was in California. Rose was in New York State. Rose ups and decides she's going to hitchhike across the country to continue the fight in person, and did.
What a woman.
It
What a woman.
is not a surprise that this woman was the inspiration for what I just said was what I believe is the greatest
Yes.
musical ever written, or close to it. We've got My Fair Lady in there, maybe.
What inspired you to write this book?
I realized when I was a little girl, it was the first Broadway show I ever saw with Angela Lansbury. And I came out afterwards, and I looked up at the sign. It said Gypsy, a musical fable. And my mother and father are teachers, and I said to them, what do you mean, fable? I said, how could this be a fable? They're real people. There really was a Gypsy, and there really was a June. And they said, oh, it was probably, edited for public consumption. The whole story, they probably had to change everything. And I'm like, how can they do that? If it's a true story. I'd never heard that. So from that point on, I wanted more information.
And why was it called? Why did it legally have to be called a musical fable?
Because June tried to stop the show. That's why. June did not like the way she was depicted on the stage in Gypsy. She got one of the children, I think it was the child, I'm not sure if it was the child or the adult, the older June in the show. She got one of them fired because she didn't like how they were portraying her. She started making a list of demands of script changes that she wanted them to make that were outrageous. One of them was she wanted them to say she was 11 years old when she ran off and got married. And she was 15. I mean, it's like, it boggles the mind. It absolutely boggles the mind.
Was it David Merrick who finally said?
David Merrick put his foot down, yes. David Merrick had been a lawyer, and he put his foot down, and he said he remembered June's and Gypsy's half-sister, Betty Hovick, that Gypsy had brought out in 1935 for a vacation, her half-siblings. And he remembered hearing the story that there was this half-sister he thought was named Beth, but her name was Betty. And After that, he said if there was another third daughter named Beth, there could be more children. If there were more children, they were in the Vaudeville Act. Okay, that's it. We're changing June's name to Claire. We're going on with the show. She's written out. And the minute they did that, signed the release, let them, reinstate her, even though she did not like the way she was being depicted, but she let them reinstate her.
And it's pretty much all she's known for today.
I know.
Well, okay, and pal Joey. So it is the true story of America's most notorious stage mother.
No lies.
Mama Rose's turn. Carolyn Quinn, thank you so much.
Who's the publisher?
Oh, it's published by the University of
Press of Mississippi.
Mississippi with gorgeous end papers and fantastic pictures. And this is, for those of you who are interested in Gypsy, and I know you're out there, get this book.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our thanks to the Friends of Theater Talk for their significant contribution to this production. Theater Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Lowe Foundation, the Corey and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, the Noel Coward Foundation, Carrie J. Fries, the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, plus public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency, and the Theater Development Fund's Technical Accessibility Program, which helps provide closed captioning.
We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you and good night.